When driving through California cities, you might notice there's an incredible amount of homeless individuals. You go to any other state, Oregon, Nevada, Texas, New York, or Mississippi, and you notice there are far more people sleeping on the streets right here in California. The data backs up what your eyes would witness. California is home to 50% of the nation's unsheltered individuals, despite the state only having 12% of the nation's population. New York, Texas, and Florida combined have less homeless people than California. You'd be lucky to find a street in the outskirts of downtown LA that isn't littered with homeless. In the state's capital, the story is no different. Sacramento has some of the largest homeless camps in California and the country. There are nearly 10,000 homeless people in a city of 525,000. The number of homeless people has nearly quadrupled in the last 7 years and has left many pointing fingers at what or who is responsible. In this project, I will be exploring the causes of homelessness, identify what policies implemented by California and its cities have failed to reduce the number of homeless, research what other cities and states have done differently, and ultimately propose a solution to the crisis in California. Let's get started by identifying the primary causes of homelessness. The most agreed upon cause is always the first to come to mind: addiction. Addiction to drugs or alcohol can do three things to a person which can cause them to become homeless. Number one, lack of money. A person with substance abusive issues will likely spend a lot of money in order to obtain whatever they are addicted to. If they spend too much money, they may no longer be able to afford their current housing accommodation. After becoming homeless, they will likely spend whatever money they can scrounge up to feed their addiction without putting it towards fixing their situation. 2. Hireability issues. A person with a strong addiction will likely not be able to keep a job. If they go homeless, they will be unhireable, not be able to make money to get out of their situation. It is a vicious cycle. 3. Destruction of social life. Addiction can put pressure on your relationships with other people and can deteriorate your mental health, and you might not be supported by close family members during a time of financial need. Estimates vary. The amount of homeless people that have an addiction issue is likely between 40 to 75%, according to various studies performed in California and the United States. Of course, there are other root causes of homelessness. Disability is another large issue. According to the SAMHSA, 30% of chronically homeless individuals in the United States have suffered from mental illness, and according to the California Healthcare Foundation, a total of 42% of people suffer from either mental illness, physical disability, or both. Many homeless have mental health issues, physical disabilities, and substance abuse issues at the same time. Economic issues are at play as well. There are two types of homelessness that should be understood for the remainder of this project. Number one, long-term homelessness. These are people who have suffered a specific circumstance that essentially prevents them from functioning in society. They're homeless most nights and experience what is called chronic homelessness. According to the California Budget and Policy Center, 32% of homeless people experience long-term homelessness. The grand majority of these people have a physical disability, addiction, or mental disability. They are usually the people you see sleeping under bridges or on the roadside. Number 2, short-term homelessness. Individuals or families who have found themselves at risk for homelessness due to financial hardship, not due to some sort of personal condition. Homelessness is short-term for 68% of Californians, according to the California Budget and Policy Center. The majority of the 68% are not people with addiction or disability, but rather financial issues. Usually these people are functioning members of society who slip through the cracks. They are usually able to remain housed due to state programs. California has done a pretty good job of keeping these individuals housed in some way, and they're usually not the people you see out on the streets. Another factor is housing and rent costs. If housing and rent costs are too high, a person may not be able to afford a home or a place to live and fall into homelessness. This is particularly relevant in California, where housing prices are some of the highest in the country. According to Forbes, California has the second highest average housing cost of any state in America. The average cost of a house is a staggering $683,000. Combined with a substantial property tax of 0.73%, it is essentially impossible for a person on the lower end of the economic spectrum to afford a home in the city. Of course, you could rent an apartment. According to a research done by Experian, California rent prices are the highest in the country. Renters can expect to pay $2,542 a month for an apartment in California. The result of these high prices is that it is very difficult for a homeless person to lift themselves up out of homelessness, and that someone who lost their job or is going through a tough time financially may find themselves nearing homelessness. However, there are a couple things that should be noted here. Number 1, rent is potentially cheaper elsewhere. Let's use the median rent of the cheapest state in the country as an example. West Virginia averages $866 monthly. However, homeless individuals would still struggle to pay. The issue isn't that most homeless people don't have enough means to afford a home, it's that they have no means at all, whether from addiction or mental illness or some other circumstance. Essentially, the effect of high housing prices is limited because for most people living on the street, a house could cost $30,000 or $2 million and it wouldn't make a difference to them. Finding some way to lower housing prices even dramatically isn't a solution for the homelessness crisis. Most homeless people, at least those who have been homeless for a long time, will be unaffected unless their homes are literally free with no strings attached. Number 2, there are a few California government programs that help people at risk for homelessness, especially those who have children or work, to be relocated if they were to find themselves homeless. California has been renovating hotels into temporary shelters to quickly relocate people who have fallen into homelessness and allow them to get back on their feet again. California also has laws that make it extremely difficult for landlords to evict tenants that have fallen behind in rent. All in all, there are some safety nets for those struggling financially to not fall into homelessness, though most government programs do not make a large difference in the lives of those who are chronically homeless. The remaining portion of this project will focus on those who are chronically long-term homeless and not those who are suffering from financial homelessness. This is for a number of reasons. People who have simply slipped through the cracks are functioning members of society like everyone else. They are usually able to fix their situation because they do not suffer from any special circumstances. Number 2, due to the fact that short-term homelessness is, short-term, their plight is less great than those who suffer from it chronically. Number 3, the solution to reducing the number of short-term homeless people is simple: cheaper housing prices and a stronger economy. While easier said than done, we don't have to fix an addiction or offer mental health support programs to assist. The solution is more clear-cut, even if it's hard. Number 4, when we think of homelessness, most of it is chronic. Think about people living in tents on the curb. So it would help our cities greatly to end chronic homelessness. Chronic homelessness hurts our businesses and society more than short-term does. Now that we have identified the root causes of homelessness and decided to focus on the issue of chronic homelessness, it's time to rank the causes of homelessness based on how prevalent they are in causing chronic homelessness. Number 1, the most prevalent cause of chronic homelessness is addiction. Based on an average of studies, I'm estimating the percentage of people whose addiction is the primary cause of their homelessness at 50% of all homeless in California, chronically homeless that is. The second most prevalent cause of chronic homelessness in California is a disability. Based on an average of studies, I will put the amount of homeless in California that suffer from disability at 35%, though this has significant overlap with those who suffer from addiction. According to a study by Stanford College, 75% of chronically homeless in California suffered from an addiction, disability, or both. These two issues of addiction and disability seem to make up the grand majority of chronically homeless in California. 3, financial issues / housing prices. Like mentioned previously, most of those who suffer from financial hardships and cannot afford their current housing accommodation do not become chronically homeless. However, financial hardships can be a result of the previous two causes, and a few people are chronically homeless due to financial issues alone, so we shouldn't completely discount them. Simply put, it is obvious that the inability to afford a home is essentially the only cause of homelessness, but this is redundant to look into because it doesn't address why people can't afford a home, which is mostly addiction and disability. Now that we have identified the two most prevalent causes of chronic homelessness, it is time to look into how to solve these two issues. As aforementioned, these two causes make up 75% of chronic homelessness in California, so creating policies that effectively deal with them will see a large drop in people sleeping in the streets. To start, we will look at what state policies have been put in place to address these factors and compare them to the policies of cities and states which have lower rates of homelessness to hopefully find out why California's policies have evidently failed. First, we will take a look at the policies of Houston, Texas. The city of Houston first identified a specific homeless encampment that had one and gone and organized apartments for the people living there. The apartments were tiny, just one bedroom, but cheap and better than living on the street. When Houston was ready to demolish the camp, the homeless individuals were transferred directly to the apartments instead of simply being scattered or given a tenuous stay at a nearby homeless shelter. They were allowed to remain in the apartments free of charge for 1 to 2 years. The moving homeless don't have to find a job or get clean from drugs before they move. Once they move, that is when they are able to get back on their feet again. To help them with supplies and costs, Houston has assembled and united a coalition of private charity and local organizations to help. Houston is directly moving individuals from streets into homes. The Houston system is directly battling and focusing on chronic homelessness and helping people with addiction or disability instead of focusing on functioning people with jobs that are going to be housed again in some weeks. Focusing on chronic homelessness reduces the number of homeless on the streets more than battling short-term homelessness, even though there are a greater number of short-term homeless. The results are real to back up this logic. Since 2011, Houston has moved 25,000 people living outdoors permanently off the streets and has seen a 63% reduction in homelessness overall and has done twice as well at reducing homelessness as the rest of the country. According to homelessnesshouston.org, it is expected that there are 3,223 people experiencing homelessness at a single time in Houston. In the capital of California, Sacramento, a city with over 5 times less people, we expect 9,200 homeless. Obviously, there's something to learn from Houston when it comes to reducing chronic homelessness in California and its cities. Another place that has been good at keeping homeless to a minimum is Mississippi. Mississippi is statistically the poorest state in the country, consistently ranks low on most stats except for one, homelessness, where it has the lowest homeless rate in the entire country. The homelessness rate in Mississippi is 37 out of 10,000 people, while the homelessness rate in California is 900 out of 100,000 people. In the state's largest city, Jackson, public officials go out and meet homeless people and give them options to stay in a hotel for free for 60 days while local organizations help them get back on their feet. The main takeaway from successful policies on homelessness is that if someone is drowning, then you can't only help them under the condition that they learn to swim first. Homeless people need to be safe from drowning and then learn to swim. These steps have worked for areas with far less money than California. There's no reason why a streamlined process like this one wouldn't work in our cities too. The reason these policies work is because they focus on the largest causes of chronic homelessness and take a direct approach. So, this is the question of why California has a much higher homeless population than Houston or Mississippi. It has more money and resources than the other two. According to the California Budget Report in May 2022, California has a $100 billion surplus, so it should be able to reduce its homeless population more effectively because it has far more resources. There are a few types of homeless shelters that cities and states build, and they are part of the key to why California's homeless population is so much greater than other areas. Number 1. Emergency shelters. These are places where homeless people can go and sleep and get cleaned up. Most homeless will not be able to stay in them for extended periods of time, and they are shared with other homeless individuals. While these shelters are good at not letting people die to the elements, they don't really help people get out of chronic homelessness. Number 2. Transitional housing. Transitional housing is set up for certain segments of the homeless population, including those whose wages are too low to afford permanent shelter. These are great at keeping short-term homelessness off the streets and can prevent short-term homelessness from becoming chronic, but they also aren't a huge factor in reducing chronic homelessness as we have seen in other areas. Number 3. Permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing is set up and subsidized for certain segments of the homeless population, especially those with chronic conditions such as disability and addiction. This is the type of housing which has been majorly successful in reducing the homeless population of places like Texas and Mississippi. According to a graph from HUD, Housing Inventory Count, there are over 60,000 permanent supportive housing beds, 40,000 emergency shelter beds, and less than 20,000 transitional housing beds. There are more permanent supportive housing beds than the other two, but still not nearly enough to house California's 525,000 homeless. We can do just some quick math to see how many permanent shelter beds California would actually need. Considering that permanent supportive housing is mostly intended for chronically homeless individuals, and 32% of California's homeless are chronically homeless, we can do 0.32 times 525,000 to calculate that California would need 168,000 permanent supportive housing beds, nearly triple that of the current number. Permanent shelters have stagnated since 2017 as well, and the growth of emergency shelter beds has skyrocketed. California hasn't been building enough housing nor the right types of housing to reduce the number of chronic homelessness. An example of this is that recently the city of Sacramento made an agreement to create 600 more homeless shelter beds. There are 10,000 homeless people in Sacramento on any given night. Not only that, these are temporary emergency beds. This kind of policy will not reduce the rate of homelessness in the city or in the state. Now that we have identified what areas with far lower rates of homelessness than California have done, what California has done differently, I'll be proposing a multiple step plan on how California can reduce homelessness a significant degree. Number 1, build far more permanent supportive housing and prioritize it over the other two types of housing. Basic supply and demand economics suggests the more homes there are, the cheaper they will be. To reduce costs, cities should build them on the outskirts of the cities or right outside of them. The government should reserve some of these apartments to move homeless people into, and the rest of them will act as cheap housing for those at risk for homelessness. These apartments will likely not be ideal as they will be quite cheap, but they're miles better than being homelessness. The money should come from our budget surplus. Half of it has already been committed to education. That leaves $50 billion to start building cheap housing. Another way California could reduce the housing shortage is to loosen up zoning laws. There are lots of regulations that tell private businesses where they can't construct apartments. This will lower homeless housing prices, and California could buy some apartments off of these companies to use to house homeless people. Number 2, identify homeless populations encampment that should be prioritized to remove. California should prioritize large camps in areas that hurt businesses and generally cause the most damage to cities and the livelihoods of people living there. Number 3, send public officials out to the camps with apartments ready and ask the individuals living there if they would like to move to temporary housing and provide transportation to said housing. Remember, homeless people are living on land that isn't theirs, so Number 3, send public officials out to the camps with apartments ready and ask the individuals living there if they would like to move to temporary housing and provide transportation to said housing. Remember, homeless individuals are living on lands that aren't theirs, so they can be forced to leave. Many homeless people would not want to leave the city as it is easiest to fuel an addiction while in it. But we can't force them to go to the housing prepared. We can't give them the ultimatum of having to find a new place to set up camp or moving to the housing we have prepared. Number 4, prepare a coalition of organizations and private charities ready to provide addiction and mental health services to the now housed individuals. These organizations should also provide clothes and necessities to the individuals, and once they have been off drugs for an amount of time, help them draft a resume for a job. Once they get a job, the amount of time the individual is allowed to stay housed should be increased as they are showing that they can and are getting back on their feet again. Eventually, the free housing will have to be removed, but with some government aid and the fact that the individual has re-entered society, cities like Houston and Jackson have proved that the individual is unlikely to re-enter chronic homelessness. High levels of support should be slowly removed, not all at once, so the individual can slowly learn to support themselves, decreasing the risk of falling back into homelessness. California and its cities have enough resources to make such a plan happen, and even if the problem isn't reduced in the short term, I believe that we will experience a great long-term reduction of homelessness with my plan. My plan focuses on helping homeless people not drown before they learn to swim. No matter the case, California has been performing poorly in reducing homelessness. We need to take another course of action. We can't expect to do the same thing over and over and expect to change. With dedication and generosity, we can really make a difference. Thank you for viewing my MYP personal project.